Jean Baudrillard, early writings from the system of objects of the mirror of production. Jean Baudrillard was born in the cathedral town of Reims, France, in 1929. He told interviewers that his grandparents were peasants and his parents became civil servants. Baudrillard also claims that he was the first member of his family to pursue an advanced education, and that this led to a rupture with his parents and cultural media. In 1956, he began working as a professor of secondary education in a French high school lycée, and in the early 1960s did editorial work for the French publisher Seuil. Baudrillard was initially a Germanist, who published essays on literature and le temps moderne in 1962 to 63, and translated works of Peter Weiss and Bertolt Brecht into French, as well as a book on Messianic revolutionary movements by Wilhelm Movement. During this period, he met and studied the works of Henri Lefebvre, whose critiques of everyday life impressed him, and Roland Barthes, whose semiological analyses of contemporary society had lasting influence on his work. In 1966, Baudrillard entered the University of Paris, Nanterre, and became Lefebvre's assistant while studying languages, philosophy, sociology, and other disciplines. He defended his troisième cycle in sociology at Nanterre in 1966 with a dissertation on le système des objets, and began teaching sociology in October of that year. Opposing French and U.S. intervention in the Algerian and Vietnamese wars, Baudrillard associated himself with the French left in the 1960s. Nanterre was a key site of radical politics, and the March 22nd movement associated with Daniel Cohn-Bendit and Guillaume Raché began in the Nanterre Sociology Department. Baudrillard said later that he participated in the events May 1968 that resulted in a massive student uprising and a general strike that almost drove de Gaulle from power. During the late 1950s, Baudrillard published a series of books that would eventually make him world famous, influenced by Lefebvre, Barthes, and a series of French thinkers whose influence will be discussed below. Baudrillard undertook serious work in the field of social theory, semiology, and psychoanalysis in the 1960s, and published his first book, The System of Objects, in 1968. On the Consumer Society in 1970, and for a critique of the political economy of the sign. These early publications are attempts, within the framework of critical sociology, to combine studies of everyday life, initiated by Lefebvre, with a social semiology that studies the life of science and social life. This project, influenced by Barthes, centers on the system of objects in the consumer society, the focus of his first two books, and the interface between political economy and semiotics, the nucleus of his third book. Baudrillard early work was one of the first to appropriate semiology to analyze how objects are encoded with the system of signs and meanings that constitutes contemporary media and consumer societies. Combining semiological studies, Marxian political economy, and sociology of the consumer society, baudrillard began his lifelong task of exploring the system of objects and signs which forms our everyday life. The early baudrillard described the meanings invested in the objects of everyday life, aging and power accrued through identification with one's automobile driving, and the structural system through which objects were organized into a new modern society. Sign value of a new sports car. In his first 3 books, Baudrillard maintained that the classical Marxian critique of political economy needed to be supplemented by semiological theories of design which articulated the diverse meanings signified by the signifiers in languages, organized into systems of meaning. Baudrillard, following others, argued that fashion, sports, the media, and other modes of signification produced systems of meaning articulated by specific rules, codes, and logic, terms used somewhat interchangeably by Baudrillard, which elucidated in more detail below, situating his analysis of science, language, and everyday life in a historical framework. Baudrillard argued that the transition from the earlier stage of competitive market capitalism to the stage of monopoly capitalism required increased attention to demand management, to augmenting and steering consumption. At this historical stage, from around 1920 to the 1960s, the need to intensify demand supplemented concern with lowering production costs and expanding production. In this era of capitalist development, economic concentration, production techniques, and the development of new technologies accelerated capacity for mass production, and capitalist corporations focused and increased attention on managing consumption and creating needs for new prestigious goods, thus producing the regime of what Baudrillard has called sign value. On Baudrillard's analysis, advertising, packaging, display, fashion, emancipated sexuality, mass media and culture, and proliferation of the commodities multiplied by the quantity of signs and spectacles, and produced the proliferation of sign value. Henceforth, Baudrillard claims commodities are not merely to be characterized by use value and exchange value, as in Marx's theory of the commodity, but sign value, the expression and mark of style, prestige, luxury, power, and so on, becomes an increasingly important part of the commodity and consumption. Goldman, Papson. From this perspective, Baudrillard claims that commodities are brought and displayed as much of sign value as their use value, and that the phenomenon of sign value has become an essential constituent of the commodity and consumption in the consumer society. This origin influenced by Vidian's notion of conspicuous consumption and display of commodities, analyzed in his theory of the leisure class that Baudrillard argued has become extended to everyone in the consumer society. For Baudrillard, the entire society is organized around consumption and display of commodities, through which individuals gain prestige, identity, and standing in the system. The more prestigious one's commodities, houses, cars, clothes, and so on, the higher one's standing in the realm of sign of value. Thus, just as words take on meaning according to their position in a differential system of language, so sign values take on meaning according to their place in a differential system of prestige and status. In the consumer society, Baudrillard concludes by extolling multiple forms of refusal of social convention, conspicuous consumption, and conformist thought and behavior, all of which can be fused in a practice of radical change. He alludes here to the expectation of violent eruptions and sudden disintegration come just as unforeseeably, certainly in May 68, to wreck this white mass of consumption. On the other hand, Baudrillard also describes a situation where alienation is so total that it cannot be surpassed because of the very structure of market society. His argument is that in a society where everything is a commodity that can be bought and sold, alienation is total. Indeed, the term alienation originally signified the sale, and in a totally commodified society, alienation is ubiquitous. Moreover, Baudrillard posits the end of transcendence, a phrase borrowed from Marquis, where individuals can neither perceive their own true need or another way of life. Baudrillard and neo-Marxism. By 1970, Baudrillard has distinguished himself from the Marxist theory of revolution, and instead postulates only the possibility of revolt against the consumer society in an unforeseeable but certain form. In the late 1960s, he had associated himself with a group of intellectuals around the Journal Utopie, which sought to overcome disciplinary boundaries and in the spirit of Guy Debord, and in the Situationist International to combine reflections on alternative societies, architecture, and modes of everyday life, bringing together individuals on the margins of architecture, city planning, cultural criticism, and social theory. Baudrillard and his associates distinguished themselves from other political and theoretical groupings and developed idiosyncratic and marginal discourse beyond the boundaries of established disciplines and political tendencies. This affiliation with Utopie only lasted into the early 1970s, but it may have helped produce in him a desire to work on margins, to stand aside from current trends and fads, and to develop his own theoretical positions. His articles from this project have been collected in English. Translation in Utopia Deferred, 2006-8. Baudrillard thus had an ambivalent relation ambivalent relation to classical Marxism by the early 1970s. On one hand, he carried forward a Marxian critique of commodity production, which delineates and criticizes the various forms of alienation, domination, and exploitation produced by capitalism. At this stage, it appeared that his critique takes place from a standard neo-Marxian vantage point, which assumes that capitalism is blameworthy. It is homogenizing, controlling, dominating social life, while robbing individuals of their freedom, creativity, time, and human potentiality. On the other hand, he cannot point at any revolutionary forces, and in particular did not discuss the situation and potential of the working class as an agent of change in the consumer society. Indeed, Baudrillard had no theory of the subject as an active agent of social change whatsoever, and thus following the structuralist and post-structuralist critique of the philosophical and practical subject categorized by Descartes and Sartre, which was long dominated by structuralists and post-structuralists, argued that subjectivity was produced by language, social institutions, and cultural forms, and was not independent of its constitutions and these institutions and practices. Nor does Baudrillard develop a theory of class or group, revolt, or any theory of political organization, struggle, or strategy of sort frequent in post-1960s France. Yet Baudrillard's work here is particularly close to the work of the Frankfurt School, especially that of Herbert Marcuse, who had already developed some of the first Marxist critiques of the consumer society. See Kellner, 1984 and 1989, like Luca, 1971, Frankfurt School. Baudrillard analyzes how the commodity and commodification permeate social life and come to dominate individual thought and behavior. Following the general line of critical Marxism, Baudrillard argues that the process of social homogenization, alienation, and exploitation constitutes a process of reification of commodities, technologies, and things, i.e., objects, come to dominate people, subjects, divesting them of their human qualities and capacities. For Luca, the Frankfurt School, and Baudrillard, reification, the process whereby human beings become dominated by things and become more thing-like themselves, comes to govern social life, conditions of labor-imposed submission, and standardization on human life, as well as exploiting workers, alienating them from life of freedom and self-determination. In a media and consumer society, culture and consumption also became homogenized, depriving individuals of the possibility of cultivating individuality and self-determination. In a sense, Baudrillard's work can be read as an account of a further stage of reification and social domination than that described by the Frankfurt School, who described how individuals were controlled by ruling institutions and modes of thought. Baudrillard goes beyond the Frankfurt School by applying the semiological theory of design to describe how commodities, media, and technologies provide the universe of evolution and fantasy, in which individuals become overpowered by ideologies and role models, and seductive technologies like computers, which provide worlds of cyberspace. Eventually, he will do his analysis of domination, science, and the system of objects to even more pessimistic conclusions, where he concludes that the thematic of the end of the individual, sketched by the Frankfurt School, has reached its fruition. The total defeat of human subjectivity by the object world. Yet, in some writings, Baudrillard has a somewhat more active theory of consumption than that of the Frankfurt schools, that generally portrays consumption as a passive mode of social integration. By contrast, consumption in Baudrillard's early writings is itself a kind of labor, an active manipulation of science, a way of inserting oneself within the consumer society, and working to differentiate oneself from others. Yet this active manipulation of science is not equivalent to postulating an active human subject could resist, redefine, or produce its own science. Thus, Baudrillard fails to develop a genuine theory of agency. Baudrillard's first three works can thus be read in the framework of a neo-Marxian critique of capitalist societies. One could read Baudrillard's emphasis on consumption as a supplement to Marx's analysis of production, and his focus on culture and science as an important supplement to the classical Marxian political economy, which adds a cultural and semiological dimension to the Marxian project. But in his 1973 provocation, The Mirror of Production, Baudrillard carries out a systematic attack on classical Marxism, claiming that Marxism is but a mirror of bourgeois society, placing production at the center of life, thus naturalizing the capitalist organization of society. Although in 1960, Baudrillard participated in the tumultuous events of May 1968, and was associated with the revolutionary left and Marxism. He broke with Marxism. He broke with Marxism in the early 1970s, but remained politically radical, though unaffiliated the rest of the decade. Like many on the left, Baudrillard was disappointed that the French Communist Party did not support the Radical 60s movement, and he also distrusted the official Marxism theorists like Louis Althusser, found dogmatic and reductive. Consequently, Baudrillard began a radical critique of Marxism, one that would be repeated by many of his contemporaries, who would also take a postmodern turn. See Best and Calendar, 1991-97. Baudrillard, 75, argues that Marxism does not adequately illuminate pre-modern societies organized around religion, mythology, and tribal organization, and not production. He also argues that Marxism does not provide a sufficiently radical critique of capitalist societies and alternative critical discourses and perspective. At this stage, Baudrillard turns to anthropological perspectives on pre-modern societies for hints of more emancipatory alternatives. Yet, It is important to note that this critique of Marxism was taken from the left, arguing that Marxism did not provide radical enough critique of or alternative to contemporary capitalist and communist societies organized around production. Baudrillard concluded that French communist failure to support May 68 movements was rooted in part in a conservatism that had roots in Marxism itself. Hence, Baudrillard and others of his generation began searching for alternative critical positions.